hope I speak to people, and I know I do. There's no doubt about that. Even if you have come across this sermon or this video by mistake, and you're listening to it, nonetheless, I hope I'm speaking to people who wish to be freed from ignorance. Because they're looking for answers. Answers to the problem of existence. An answer to the problem of why is it that my entire life has been an exercise of pursuing a perceived happiness, what I believe is happiness, and yet to this date I'm uncontented. I'm not satisfied. I'm not fulfilled. And I'm not happy. Why is it that I have spent an entire lifetime? Why is it that I have not spared any expense to experience pleasure, but yet I'm not content? I'm not happy. I'm not fulfilled. Something's missing. I hope I'm peeping. I hope I'm speaking to people who think like that. People who seek answers. People who are not content with the happiness that they have sought so far. Like I said a couple of sermons ago, I remember the reason I became a monk was because I'm greedy for happiness. Mundane types of happiness that keep most of you people happy just doesn't tick it for me. It just doesn't cut it for me. Doesn't float my boat. I seek a happiness that goes beyond what most people out there experience. When people seek pleasure in food, in going around places, in surrounding themselves with all sorts of luxury items and artifacts, I I'm not content with that. I want more. So when people think that Buddhist philosophy is for losers, I think it's only a loser who'd think like that. Buddhist philosophy is for those people. As I'm saying, people just take it. That's people how people almost always are, right? They always get the wrong end of the stick. It's a natural tendency that people have to always get the wrong end of the stick. What is Buddhism for? People say it is to give up everything. And that's where the problem is. Never must you advocate that Buddhism is about giving up everything. If someone ever comes up to you and asks you, what is Buddhism? Is it true that Buddhism is about giving up everything? Without any reservation, and make it without any room for doubt, respond to that question with no, none, and no whatsoever. Buddhism is not about giving up anything. Buddhism is about striving to achieve a happiness that cannot be found in a mundane existence. And for that, all you need to do is realize. Buddhism is simply about realization. It is nothing to do with giving up. So please don't find yourself trying to evangelize Buddhism to someone, maybe a non believer or a non Buddhist even. Don't catch yourself saying Buddhism is about giving up. Don't catch yourself saying, I'm bound and I'm attached to all these things, right? My family, my work, my mortgage, my car, and all these things, they're just a lot of suffering. So I'm trying to give up all that. Therefore, I want to take up Buddhism. I want to go to a meditation class. I'm going to study Buddhism so that I can give up everything. You're barking up the wrong tree. It's not Buddhism you need. If you want to give up everything, become a yogi. I hear there are quite a few of them up in the Himalayas. You don't need Buddhism for that, to give up anything. Just put everything to a side and pack up and go. Actually, there won't be much to pack up because you want to give up everything, don't you? So leave everything behind and just go. Buddhism is nothing like that. It's not about giving up anything. It's about realizing. And we discussed this in one of the previous sermons. So, in Buddhist philosophy, we learn how to achieve a happiness that cannot be obtained, that cannot be achieved through the pursuit of mundane materialism. The materials that you see around you, you can categorize them broadly to sights and sounds, smells and tastes, and touch. There's also a sixth which you can include in the interest of completeness, and that is thoughts or mental objects, memories, if you like. Thought objects, things that you think of mentally. So, sights and sounds, smells and taste, touch, and mental objects. Ideas, if you like. When you haven't realized them, when you haven't understood them, there'll be a tendency to seek pleasure from them. But unfortunately, every effort made to achieve pleasure from them is going to fall flat on its face. It's never going to be successful. It's never going to be productive. Why? Because pleasure is not to be found in the things that people look for them. Even if you could find an oasis in the great Saharan desert, even if it were to rain en masse, you wouldn't find pleasure in sights and sounds, smells and taste, touch, and mental objects. This is the doctrine, this is the teaching that we have been trying to share with you all along. However, you may have your own reservations and you may have your own, you may be skeptical. You may have your doubts. And I understand why I empathize. Why it is that people feel that there is logic in what we say in the Dhamma, in these sermons, but you fail to experience that. And the reason for that, folks, is that your experience is in contrary to what we preach, isn't it? I mean, experience without the inspection. If you don't inspect, if you don't examine this experience of pleasure that you have when you look at something and you say it's beautiful, the experience of pleasure that you have when you listen to something and you say that's lovely, sounds really nice, the experience that you have when you taste something and you say, oh, that's delicious, the experience that you have when you inhale as you hold a bottle of perfume to your nose and say, that smells wonderful. The experience that you have, the pleasurable experience that you have when you think of lovely thoughts, old memories, sentimental, they may be. These experiences, the actual experience seems to be at odds with the doctrine, does it not? Because when you bite into that apple, does it not really taste good? When you lap up that ice cream, doesn't it really taste good? When you look at your garden in your backyard, and when you have the flowers in full bloom, doesn't it look so lovely? Isn't that just so picturesque? So you see, your experience seems to be at odds with the doctrine. And then, whereas on the other hand, science seems to be working hard at doing whatever it can through experimentation, through new technology, to maximize the pleasure that can be delivered with each punch of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. I bet even right now, in the laboratories of world famous pizza companies, where they manufacture fast food, and pizza being one of the most popular items of fast food, I bet even at this point in time, somewhere in a laboratory, someone's trying to work out how can we maximize that delicious taste? How can we pack even more deliciousness into a slice of pizza? And for that, they don't go to Buddhist philosophy, they look at science. They're looking at chemical balances. They're looking at the properties of molecules. They're studying physics. They're studying biology. They're trying to work out how can we pack even more deliciousness onto a slice of pizza. And for that, they use science. And there'll be some branch of science that has been invented to deal with that. So you see, unfortunately, to this day, science continues to try and deliver something that it is never going to be able to. And that is not the fault of science. Just as much as it is not the fault of the guy who invented the knife that someone decides to get one and slice his throat with it. It's not the guy who invented the knife to be blamed for that. That was not what the knife was invented for. Likewise, science was not invented to cook up some lies. It was invented to help people understand the truth. But unfortunately, science is being abused. It is being used to try and pack as much pleasure into every punch of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Just as much as there'll be food laboratories, there'll be sight laboratories where they're trying to use science to work out how can we make something look even more beautiful? How can we make something smell even more lovely? How can we make something sound even more melodious? The irony of it is, science was not invented for that. In fact, I suppose you couldn't say science an invention of science. It is what we use to explain what we see around us. But unfortunately, you see something and you try and find a falsehood to explain it, and you haven't moved any further towards the truth. To explain a lie, you're using another lie. Now what happens? To explain something you see, you use a lie, you use a flawed mechanism. Now you're never going to get to the truth. And so, to try and pack as much pleasure into people's lives, which people have today considered to be the ultimate purpose of science, I think is a total waste of what science is and what science could have been. Every step that scientists make to try and pack pleasure into people's lives, rather than to try and understand how pleasure works, I think is a waste of science. In science land, that would be treason. It would be treachery. It would be the abuse of science. And I think science is being abused in broad daylight. Because that is not what science is for. It is not there to try and pack as much pleasure into stuff. It's there to understand how is it that something is pleasurable. Just like that is what Buddhist philosophy tries to teach us. Now, I'm also pleased, however, to have come across something that I thought I ought to share with you. I stumbled upon in my study of psychology, which I have taken up as a recent engagement, because I want to try and help people understand the world from their point of view. You see, for a mathematician to understand the truth, you got to talk to him through math. For a scientist to understand the world, you got to talk to him through science, because that's the language that they speak. At the end of the day, our purpose is to help as many people as possible realize the truth and ultimately free themselves from suffering. That is our purpose as the Sangha. Free ourselves from suffering and help others, as many others as possible along the way. That's why we learn languages. At our monastery, we learn a whole bunch of languages. Sinhala, of course, being our native tongue, to English, to Mandarin, to Hindi, Korean, Tamil. These are just some of the languages that our monks and anagarikas learn, as well as our anagarikas as well. Spanish. Because we appreciate that sometimes we need to step into other people's shoes to help them see what it is that we have seen. We need to speak their language. And I mean this both metaphorically as well as literally. So, a scientist, to be able to see the world as it really is, well, I'll need to be able to speak science. So, it is well regarded that psychology is the study of the mind, and of course, people, I think, have no issue with thinking that pleasure is an experience of the mind, although people believe that it comes from the outside world. But you need a mind to experience it. That's why a dead body does not experience pleasure. Right? So I think people are that intelligent, at least. And so we have taken it upon ourselves. We have taken the onus on ourselves to familiarize ourselves with the language of people, to try and help them understand the world. So, in my study of psychology of late, I had the good fortune of coming across a fine scientist, a psychologist. He's a professor of psychology. I'll get his picture up on screen for you. His name is Professor Paul Bloom. You should be able to see on screen now. So this is his bio. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Yale University. So he's well regarded, and I'm sure for any psychologist or anyone interested in, even barely interested in the study of psychology, this is a name that must be familiar to most of you. So you can read up on there some of his work and his interests. And if you just go on the internet and look him up, there'll be lots of information that you can find about him. He gives talks and lectures around the world. He holds many professorships in many universities. I think he's started his career as a professor at the well-regarded and well-honored Yale University. And the reason that I took an interest to Professor Paul Bloom was because I happened to come across a talk that was given by him on the subject of pleasure. And of course, I'm always on the lookout to help people realize the truth about pleasure. So, listening to his talk, what I found was that science is now making some progress to understand pleasure as it really is. What pleasure really is. We as Buddhists have known this for yonks. Right from when the Buddha taught this, we've known this because that's the way it is. Buddhist philosophy is the truth. And I'm not just saying this because I am of the Buddhist faith. I'm rather a practitioner of Buddhism, and because it's a free choice. And if anyone who knows what I'm like, I need things to be proved to me before I'll accept it. I choose to be a Buddhist. It was not forced upon me. Of course, as a young child, when I asked my parents, they said I was a Buddhist, but I had no idea what that meant. But I started to question the world around me, trying to explain the things that I see around me. And then I came across the teaching. And then I realized what all I had thought Buddhism was until that point was all replaced by what I discovered through my teachers as the true teaching of the Buddha. Because in the Buddha's words, pleasure is what keeps us bound to this endless suffering. It is the non realization of pleasure, would be the most appropriate way to put it, I suppose. Not necessarily pleasure, but the non realization of pleasure that keeps us bound to suffering. In other words, once you realize pleasure, once you realize what pleasure is, you're no longer bound to suffering. Now, I'm just so pleased for mankind. I don't need any of this as evidence because my evidence is my life. The application of the Dhamma has enabled me to unravel my decisions, the ways I thought, the ways I worked, how I conducted myself in various situations in life. The Dhamma has enabled me to understand myself. True freedom is that, at the end of the day, understanding yourself. So the Dhamma has enabled me to do that. But as I said, there'll be people out there who will not be interested in Buddhist philosophy. They will not be interested in what the Buddha had to say. And they will so adamantly disregard anything that is not congruent with teachings of science and technology. And it is for those, for the benefit of those, and truthfully, if I may say so myself, with compassion towards such people, that today I share this with you. I have, up until this day, talked to you about the greatest man that ever lived, the greatest philosophy that was ever taught. I talked to you about the Lord Buddha. And in his words, I attempted to explain to you the way the world works. And I attempted to explain to you how you work For most of you, that would have done it, but there'll be some among you. Even that doesn't work. So, really, what I'm having to do today is to present to you a talk by a scientist, a mundane scientist. No dishonor to him. He's well regarded, and I respect him as a psychologist, and he's a good teacher because I follow his lectures in my study of psychology. He's given a series of lectures at the Yale University, and I have been fortunate enough to get hold of them in my study of psychology. These are the lectures that I follow. So this professor, at a recent TED conference, most of you will be aware of what TED is. It's a popular global platform for well-educated, well-regarded people to come and share ideas that are worth thinking. So I would like for you to listen to what this professor has to say, because there are people who are not willing to listen to what the Buddha has to say. So I invite you to listen to what this professor has to say and consider, at least now, when science is trying to make baby steps to explain the truth of pleasure. So without further ado, I'll play the video to you. This is from a TED conference. And I may pause it from time to time just to further explain some points. But what I want you to do is to listen to this, watch this video, and see if there's anything in here that may challenge your current ways of thinking. Be open-minded, as you should always be. Whether you're a believer or a non-believer, you should always remain open-minded, because at the end of the day, what you believe or not is not what's important. It's whether you have realized the truth or not. Because it is the truth that sets you free. It is the truth that brings you happiness. Okay? So let's watch the video and we'll continue our conversation there.
I'm going to talk today about the pleasures of everyday life. But I want to begin with a story of an unusual and terrible man. This is Hermann Goering. Goering was Hitler's second-in-command in World War II, his designated successor. And like Hitler, Goering fancied himself a collector of art. He went through Europe through World War II, stealing, extorting, and occasionally buying various paintings for his collection. And what he really wanted was something by Vermeer. Hitler had 2 of them, and he didn't have any. So he finally found an art dealer, a Dutch art dealer named Han van Meegeren, who sold him a wonderful Vermeer for the cost of what would now be $10 million. And it was his favorite artwork ever. World War II came to an end, and Goering was captured, tried at Nuremberg, and ultimately sentenced to death. Then the Allied forces went through his collections and found the paintings and went after the people who sold it to him. And at some point, the Dutch police came in Amsterdam and arrested Van Meegeren. Van Meegeren was charged with the crime of treason, which is itself punishable by death. 6 weeks into his prison sentence, Van Meegeren confessed. But he didn't confess to treason. He said, "I did not sell a great masterpiece to that Nazi. I painted it myself. I'm a forger." Nobody believed him, and he said, "I'll prove it. Bring me a canvas and some paint, and I will paint a Vermeer much better than I sold that disgusting Nazi. I also need alcohol and morphine, because it's the only way I can work." So they brought him in. He painted a beautiful Vermeer, and then the charges of treason were dropped. He had a lesser charge of forgery, got a year sentence, and died a hero to the Dutch people. There's a lot more to be said about Van Meegeren, but I want to turn now to Goering, who's pictured here being interrogated at Nuremberg. Now, Goering was, by all accounts, a terrible man. Even for a Nazi, he was a terrible man. His American interrogators described him as an amicable psychopath. But you could feel sympathy for the reaction he had when he was told that his favorite painting was actually a forgery. According to his biographer, he looked as if for the first time he had discovered there was evil in the world. And he killed himself soon afterwards. He had discovered, after all, that the painting he thought was this was actually that. It looked the same, but it had a different origin. It was a different artwork. It wasn't just him who was in for a shock. Once Van Meegeren was on trial, he couldn't stop talking. And he boasted about all the great masterpieces that he himself had painted that were attributed to other artists. In particular, the Supper at Emmaus, which was viewed as Vermeer's finest masterpiece, his best work. People would come all over the world to see it, was actually a forgery. It was not that painting, but that painting. And when that was discovered, it lost all its value and was taken away from the museum. Why does this matter?
So, an interesting point to pause and think about here. So, in this story that the professor shares with us, a true historical event, he speaks of a work of art that in today's day and age would cost well over a dozen or tens of millions of dollars, lost all its value overnight simply because it was discovered that the painting had a different origin. There was no way, folks, that you could look at the two pictures, the two paintings, and say that one was different from the other. A moment ago, you saw the two paintings. They were identical in every way, except for the fact that one had history. One had a story that was different to the other. One was a forgery, the other was a true, authentic painting by the artist. See, that story about the picture, isn't that all to do with perception? The actual object on the outside, were they different in any way? How did one demand so much in value, whereas the other was completely and utterly useless, worthless? And why was it that when the Nazi that was described there, when that man had acquired that picture, not knowing that it was a forgery, he got immense pleasure out of it. I suppose that's where people might say ignorance is bliss. He didn't know the truth about the picture, but if he was questioned with the two pictures side by side, the original and the forgery, there was no way, as you weren't able to say today, there was no way that he could have said which one was which. So, is it the picture that brought him pleasure? once he found out that it was a forgery, he wouldn't have paid the price of the canvas for that picture. He wouldn't have paid what it would have cost to paint it, to buy that picture, because it was no longer worth anything. It was a worthless painting. But they looked identical. So where's pleasure then? In which picture was there pleasure? Was it in the original or was it in the forgery? It surely wasn't in both, because if it's pleasure that one seeks from buying that picture and hanging it on their wall somewhere in their art gallery, for instance, if it's pleasure that someone seeks by walking into an art gallery and studying or looking at the pictures and appreciating their artistic value, then pleasure should have been experienced from both. Why was it that one became worthless when it was discovered that one painting was that the painting that he had bought was a forgery? And before he discovered that, he was worth $10 million. Different picture or different perception of the same picture? What was it that brought him pleasure? What was it that gave him value in the picture? Was it the picture? The strokes, the colors, the color balance, the mix of colors, the artistic flair. Was it that, or was it simply the perception? Don't you think it's really interesting? We've spoken about this many times before. How is it that a picture, I remember speaking about Mona Lisa. How is it that a picture of Mona Lisa can bring someone so much pleasure? Whereas if it were a forgery, then you wouldn't look at it twice. So where is beauty? Is it in the sight? Let's continue to listen to this.
I'm a psychologist. Why do origins matter so much? Why do we respond so much to our knowledge of where something comes from? Well, there's an answer that many people would give. Many sociologists, like Veblen and Wolff, would argue that the reason why we take origins so seriously is because we're snobs, because we're focused on status. Among other things, if you want to show off how rich you are, how powerful you are, it's always better to own an original than a forgery, because there's always going to be fewer originals than forgeries. I don't doubt that plays some role, but what I want to convince you today is that there's something else going on. I want to convince you that humans are, to some extent, natural-born essentialists. What I mean by this is, we don't just respond to things as we see them, or feel them, or hear them. Rather, our response is conditioned on our beliefs about what they really are, where they came from, what they're made of, what their hidden nature is. I want to suggest that this is true not just for how we think about things, but how we react to things. So I want to suggest that pleasure is deep, and that this isn't true just for sort of higher level pleasures like art, but even the most seemingly simple pleasures are affected by our beliefs about hidden essences. So take food. Would you eat this? Well, a good answer is it depends. What is it? Some of you would eat it if it's pork but not beef. Some of you would eat it if it's beef but not pork. Few of you would eat it if it's a rat or a human. Some of you would eat it only if it's a strangely colored piece of tofu. That's not so surprising. But what's more interesting is how it tastes to you will depend critically on what you think you're eating. So one demonstration of this was done with young children. How do you make children not just be more likely to eat carrots and drink milk, but to get more pleasure from eating carrots and drinking milk, to think they taste better? It's simple. You tell them they're from McDonald's. They believe McDonald's food is tastier, and it leads them to experience it as tastier. How do you get adults to really enjoy wine? It's very simple. Pour it from an expensive bottle. There are now dozens, perhaps hundreds of studies showing that if you believe you're drinking the expensive stuff,
Now, this is where I invite you to turn back at yourselves and examine your lives. Look at the things that you have surrounded yourself with, the lifestyle that you have come to learn to live, right? Drinking wine, and how that makes you feel good. And you'd say that it tastes really good, but it so happens to be that scientists have today found out that when it's poured from an expensive bottle, it tastes better. How does that work? For that to be the case, is the taste in the wine, or is it the perception of the wine? I'm inviting you folks to think, because you know this is a crucial moment. Hopefully this will be an eye opener for most of you. For so long I've tried to explain this through Buddhist philosophy, through reason and through logic, but some of you would not have accepted it, some of you would not have paid any regard to it, because it didn't come from the mouth of a scientist, a psychologist. But today you get to hear these words from someone who you regard well in your world. This gentleman does not have all the answers, because what he says, what he speaks, is not Buddhist philosophy in its entirety. But he's getting a step. He's walking a step in that direction. But even if his talk, what you hear him say today, will get you to shed aside, at least momentarily, your strong opinions about some of the things that you hold as true and unwavering, not willing to consider a different reality, then I invite you to take a moment to turn back at your own lives and ask the question, are you living a life that you can truly be proud of? People often ask me, why did you give up this life, this lovely, wonderful life, and go into robes? Because I wasn't happy drinking bottle from drinking wine from a bottle, and thinking to myself that it tasted good simply because it came from an expensive bottle. Not that I've ever consumed any wine, but metaphorically. I wasn't happy about looking at a piece of art or having something to eat and then experiencing a fake pleasure, when actually that taste did not come from the food that I took the trouble to purchase, to prepare, to cook, to eat, to chew, to swallow, all for the purpose of taste, and then to realize actually none of that was in any of the above activities. It was simply in my perception of it. I don't like to be taken for a fool. What do you think is going on in the world out there? What's going on in your life? I ask you to consider. Listen to these words, listen to what he has to say, and ask yourself, is this the life that you live? Are you okay with that? If wine tastes better to you, or any drink for that matter, tastes better to you simply because it gets poured out of an expensive bottle, how can taste be a factor of the fact that it's poured out of an expensive bottle? You could take the same liquid, put it into a bottle, change the price tag, and it tastes better. Are you okay with that? Are you okay with the world taking you for a donkey? For an idiot? Are you okay with that? Ask yourself. So all people who are gurus in marketing have to do is simply, that's the thing. I think, marketing is, I think those people, they study Buddhist philosophy quite a bit, more so than science, because marketing is all about how you perceive things and raising the value of something in your perception. It doesn't have to be a value add in the real world. The object remains the same, but your perception of it is what marketing attempts to influence, isn't it? Well, isn't that what his talk is all about? Let's listen on and see what else we can learn.
It tastes better to you. This was recently done with a neuroscientific twist. They get people into an fMRI scanner, and while they're lying there through a tube, they get to sip wine. In front of them on a screen is information about the wine. Everybody, of course, drinks exactly the same wine. But if you believe you're drinking expensive stuff, parts of the brain associated with pleasure and reward light up like a Christmas tree. It's not just then you say it's more pleasurable, you say you like it more, you really experience it in a different way. Or take sex. These are stimuli I've used in some of my studies, and if you simply show people these pictures, they'll say these are fairly attractive people. But how attractive you find them, how sexually or romantically moved you are by them, rests critically on who you think you're looking at. You probably think the picture on the left is male, the one on the right is female. If that belief turns out to be mistaken, it will make a difference. It will make a difference if they turn out to be much younger or much older than you think they are. It may make a difference if you were to discover that the person you're looking at with lust is actually a disguised version of your son or daughter, your mother or father. Knowing somebody's your kin typically kills the libido. Maybe one of the most heartening findings from the psychology of pleasure is there's more to looking good than your physical appearance. If you like somebody, they look better to you. This is why spouses in happy marriages tend to think that their husband or wife looks much better than anyone else thinks that they do.
We have, over so many sermons and discussions, talked about this, haven't we? How at the beginning, everything seems so wonderful. They're the most attractive person that you can think of. The most beautiful person, and you feel ever so lucky to have found the perfect match. The princess of your dreams, and so on. And then over time, what happens? You realize that your boxes are not being ticked. She's not scratching my back. So more disappointments start creeping in to your relationship. And then what you once found was beautiful no longer turns out to be the case. Because there's no longer relief from vexation. At the beginning of any relationship, or at least most relationships, the pair or the two people are so very eager to satisfy each other. You're very concerned, you're very cautious, you're very careful not to tread on each other's toes. You're very thoughtful about the other person. You always check if they've eaten before you've eaten. You always check and make sure that they're comfortable before you are. So there's always them before you. So by doing that, the other person in the relationship gets a lot of the things that they want from you. So you are able to relieve them of many of their vexations. Essentially, that is what's going on under the hood. It's not about making them happy as much as it is about relieving them from their vexations. Because they're vexed about all sorts of things. People are vexed for respect, admiration, dignity. Egos have to be satisfied. Right? So when all of these things are being provided, are being satisfied, then all of a sudden the person that is giving you all this appears to be all the more attractive. But really, that attractiveness was not in the person at all, is what the professor has to say.
A particularly dramatic example of this comes from a neurological disorder known as Capgras syndrome. So Capgras syndrome is a disorder where you get a specific delusion. Sufferers of Capgras syndrome believe that the people they love most in the world have been replaced by perfect duplicates. Now, often a result of Capgras syndrome is tragic. People have murdered those that they love, believing that they were murdering an imposter. But there's at least one case where Capgras syndrome had a happy ending. This was reported in 1931. Research described a woman with Capgras syndrome who complained about her poorly endowed and sexually inadequate lover. But that was before she got Capgras syndrome. After she got it, she was happy to report that she has discovered he possessed a double who was rich, virile, handsome, and aristocratic. Of course, it was the same man, but she was seeing him in different ways. As a third example, consider consumer products. So one reason why you might like something is its utility. You can put shoes on your feet, you can play golf with golf clubs.
So take a moment to study these three objects. A pair of shoes, some golf clubs, and the thing on the bottom left corner, that's a bit of chewed bubblegum. How much would you be willing to pay for those things? See, when I ask you that question, questions come to mind, don't they now? And the questions that may come to most of you are maybe, well, what make is it? How long is it going to last? A pair of shoes, is it leather? Is it genuine leather? Who's the manufacturer? How long are they meant to last? Is it a strong build? The golf clubs? Is it of a good quality? Maybe some of the questions you have, but some chewed bubble gum? You wouldn't pay anything for that. Or would you? So they did this experiment. Let's see what they found out.
And chewed up bubblegum doesn't do anything at all for you. But each of these three objects has value above and beyond what it can do for you based on its history. The golf clubs were owned by John F. Kennedy and sold for $750,000 at auction. The bubblegum was chewed up by pop star Britney Spears and sold for several hundreds of dollars. And in fact, there's a thriving market in the partially eaten food of beloved people. The shoes are perhaps the most valuable of all. According to an unconfirmed report, a Saudi millionaire offered $10 million for this pair of shoes. They were the ones thrown at George Bush at an Iraqi press conference several years ago. Now, this attraction to objects doesn't just work for celebrity objects. Each one of us, most people, have something in their life that's literally irreplaceable, in that it has value because of its history. Maybe your wedding ring, maybe your child's baby shoes. So that if it was lost, you couldn't get it back. You could get something that looked like it or felt like it, but you couldn't get the same object back. With my colleagues, George Newman and Gil Diesendruck, we've looked to see what sort of factors, what sort of history matters for the objects that people like. So in one of our experiments, we asked people to name a famous person who they adored, a living person they adored. So one answer was George Clooney. Then we asked them, how much would you pay for George Clooney's sweater? And the answer is a fair amount, more than you would pay for a brand new sweater or a sweater owned by somebody who you didn't adore. Then we asked other groups of subjects, we gave them different restrictions and different conditions. So for instance, we told some people, look, you can buy the sweater, but you can't tell anybody you own it.
See how we attribute value to things, folks, based on what it does for us. Right? In the previous example, the golf clubs. the half-eaten breakfast by Barack Obama, the chewing gum, the pair of shoes, right? The value that was attributed to those objects were not intrinsic of the object. It was more about what it did for the people who paid that extortionate amounts for them. So it brought them pleasure. That's why they paid that money for it. And at the end of the day, that's what people do everything for, right? It's for the purpose of pleasure. Because if something brought them displeasure, then of course they wouldn't do it. If someone, that bag of golf clubs that was sold for $750,000, if they had lost the auction, how would they have felt? Disappointed. So if losing title to that object brings one disappointment, then of course acquiring it brings them pleasure. But it's not the golf club itself, but rather what it does for them. In other words, their perception of it. See, these golf clubs, the chewing gum, the pair of shoes, this sweater. George Clooney is a famous movie actor, for those who may not be familiar. These things, what it does for the person who acquires them. In other words, it feeds their ego. It makes them feel better that they are in possession of something like that. But you see, they have paid for the feeling, isn't it? Or haven't they? They have paid for the perception. So why do they acquire the object? If perception is something wholly mental, if it's a product of the function of the mind, why pay real money for a real object, a physical object? The professor speaks of someone having sentimental value for things like your grandmother's wedding ring or your first baby's shoes. I know some people hoard all kinds of things. The last thing they'll do is throw away some of the things that belong to their children when they were of a young age. Some parents wouldn't dare dream of doing something like that because they have sentimental value. In other words, their value is determined by what it does for the person who possesses it. Meaning, its value is not in the object. Meaning, pleasure is not derived from the object. Because if that were the case, then that pleasure would be available. That pleasure should be experienced by absolutely anyone. I mean, that's got to be logical. That's scientific, isn't it? My grandmother's wedding ring is going to be of absolutely no significance to you. In fact, it could be replaced with another, and if I was none the wiser, it would mean the same to me. So, you see, the ring has been replaced by a fake, by a forgery. But I still believe that it's the original, and now, therefore, it means a lot to me. I'll pay a lot of money for it. Imagine, like the Vermeer picture, the painting, what if that chewing gum was not really one that was chewed by Britney Spears, but rather by some old stranger walking down the road and say, "Hey, mister, can you chew some chewing gum for us, please? We're going to take it to an auction." Who would know? Who would know? One could say, well, we're going to do a DNA test. That's besides the point. By the sight of it, right? Who would know that it was any different to that was one that was chewed by the movie actress? So why would that demand such value? You see, it's not in the object. That much must be clear to you by now, mustn't it? That much should be clear to you. It's not in the object. The object can be replaced, but if you didn't know that it was replaced, you'd still value it as much as you did before. So that proves to us pleasure is not in the object. The object can be replaced, and if you didn't know about it, you'd pay the same money. It would value the same amount to you. In the previous example about the Capgras syndrome, so it's a real psychological disorder. I think you followed the example there, but just to briefly remind you about it again, it was about a lady who was living with her husband for many years, but she just didn't find him attractive. And then she contracted this syndrome. And what's characteristic about this syndrome is you believe that the people that you love are replaced by sometimes aliens. Aliens come and they replace them with a duplicate. And so this lady, after she contracted this syndrome, she'd been previously who she complained about as being unattractive. Now she says is the perfect man for me. I find him really attractive. Did the man change? Not a strand of hair. Same person. But now she finds him more attractive. I mean, of course, that's a psychological disorder. But isn't the rest of it the same? I mean, if that is a psychological disorder, what about all of this? How come you find something pleasurable when actually the pleasure is not in the object, but rather in the way you perceive the object? What do we mean by the way you perceive that object? That is what we've been talking about. That has been the core of our discussions. A set of indoctrinations. The professor doesn't go into that extent because for that to have happened, he needs to have come across Buddhist philosophy. That's what I'm saying. He's still trying to perfect his science, and hopefully he'll come across. I was watching these videos with our Dasahandru, who's also studying some psychology with me, and we were talking about how we wish this professor would one day be able to listen to some of these talks, our sermons, and find the missing piece to his puzzle. He thinks it's origin. He thinks it's history. He, of course, goes on to talk about the perception of things and how it is that perception that gives things value rather than any intrinsic value that is held by the object. But what is the root of that? He hasn't come that far yet. Will he? I hope he does. Science strives to become Buddhist philosophy every day. It strives for perfection. It strives for the truth. What it says is true today will tomorrow may turn out to be only half truth. I want you to think about these things. Right now it's coming from the voice of a psychologist, right? Someone you adore, someone you regard, someone you respect. Maybe a Swamin Wahanse, not so much. Maybe the great elder Sariputta, not so much. Maybe the Lord Buddha, not so much. But a psychologist, oh my God. All credit to this gentleman for what he's doing, and I wish him every success. I just think about the people who are needing of this testimony, this attestment from a scientist to accept really that Buddhist philosophy was right all along. It's in these times I feel like saying, I told you so. Let's continue.
And you can't resell it. That drops the value a bit, suggesting that that's one reason why we like it. But what really causes an effect is you tell people, look, you could resell it, you could boast about it, but before it gets to you, it's thoroughly washed. That causes a huge drop in the value. As my wife put it, you've washed away the kuni cooties. So let's go back to art. I would love a Chagall. I love the work of Chagall. If people want to get me something at the end of the conference, you could buy me a Chagall. But I don't want a duplicate. even if I can't tell the difference. That's not because, or it's not simply because I'm a snob and want to boast about having an original. Rather, it's because I want something that has a specific history. In the case of artwork, the history is special indeed. The philosopher Dennis Dutton, in his wonderful book, The Art Instinct, makes the case that the value of an artwork is rooted in assumptions about a human performance underlying its creation. And that could explain the difference between an original and a forgery. They may look alike, but they have a different history. The original is typically the product of a creative act. The forgery isn't. I think this approach can explain differences in people's taste in art. This is a work by Jackson Pollock. Who here likes the work of Jackson Pollock? Okay. Who here does nothing for them? They just don't like it? Okay. I'm not going to make a claim about who's right, but I will make an empirical claim.
Besides the main argument that the professor is trying to make here, I don't know if any of you spotted people in the room or in the auditorium when asked who here likes the work of that artist. As arms start going up, there are people in the room who look around for social acceptance. See, there's so much we can learn from these things. Human beings are fine specimens to study the mind. When armed with Buddhist philosophy, human beings are just absolutely fine specimens to observe and study. And every time you come across a human specimen and you study them through the lens of Buddhist philosophy, when I do that, a deep sense of respect and regard, and really, I'd probably say, love arises in my mind for the great master, the Buddha. How true he was, how right he was, how perfect the teaching of the perfect one was. See, they're looking around for social acceptance. Who else agrees with me? Because imagine that, when the professor asks, who here likes the work of this artist, and only one person puts their hand up. They're going to stick out like a sore thumb. And that's going to make them feel what? Incredibly awkward. That's why when you pass wind, for instance, you look around you to see if anyone heard you. But what if everyone around you was doing that? Then if you are unable to do it, that would be what would make you feel uncomfortable. Like, when friends get together and they start making weird and funny noises. And then now to fit in, you have to be like the rest of them. Because when you fit in, that gives you acceptance. That gives you value. That feeds your ego. You never want to be the odd one out. Because you feel protected. You feel safe when you're one among many. And I hope you notice that. And then again, when the professor says, who does not like, it does nothing for you. And again, arms go up, and now people are still looking around to see, who else? Who else is like me? So I can associate them. Who else is not like me? So I can keep my distance from them. Consciously or unconsciously, this happens all the time. Feeding one's ego. Again, if ego is about how you feel about yourself, and that is a wholly mental thing, the point I'm trying to get across to you today through this sermon, folks, is what meaning there is. What is the point? What is the essence? What is the significance of attributing any value whatsoever to worldly objects? The sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touch. He's taken quite a few examples in his talk. But what is the meaning of attributing value to these outside worldly things when actually all of pleasure appears to be, except maybe the touch, which we have also discussed in the past, let's leave that aside for a moment, for the time being. The remainder of things, right? What meaning is there in attributing value to that, to the outside world objects, when actually all of that is simply a mental perception? If it's a perception in the mind, then why pay so much? Why regard so much an outside worldly object? Materialism simply falls out. Let's continue.
About people's intuitions, which is that if you like the work of Jackson Pollock, you'll tend more so than the people who don't like it to believe that these works are difficult to create, that they require a lot of time and energy and creative energy. I use Jackson Pollock on purpose as an example because there's a young American artist who paints very much in the style of Jackson Pollock, and her work was worth many tens of thousands of dollars, in large part because she's a very young artist. This is Marla Olmsted, who did most of her work when she was 3 years old. The interesting point about Marla Olmsted is her family made the mistake of inviting the television program 60 Minutes 2 into their house to film her painting, and they then reported that her father was coaching her. When this came out on television, the value of her art dropped to nothing. It was the same art physically, but the history had changed. I've been focusing now on the visual arts, but I want to give two examples from music. This is Joshua Bell, a very famous violinist, and the Washington Post reporter Gene Weingarten decided to enlist him for an audacious experiment. The question is, how much would people like Joshua Bell, the music of Joshua Bell, if they didn't know they were listening to Joshua Bell? So he got Joshua Bell to take his $1 million violin down to a Washington, D.C. subway station and stand in the corner and see how much money he would make. And here's a brief clip of this. After being there for 3/4 of an hour, he made $32. Not bad. It's also not good. Apparently, to really enjoy the music of Joshua Bell, you have to know you're listening to Joshua Bell.
What does that make you feel? How does that make you feel about the music that you listen to and claim to get a lot of joy out of it? Now think about the famous artists that you wait until the day of their debut to get hold of their albums. Sometimes you'll get them on pre-order. You'll pay top dollar for them. And what if I were to tell you that it only sounds nice because you know it's from that particular person? The beauty in the sound is not in the beauty at all. It is simply your perception of it. Permit me for saying this again. I told you so. The Buddha told you so. And now science is catching up. A very famous violinist playing in a public place, anyone could have gone and listened to him. And in 3/4 of an hour, he earned just over $30. Whereas had he played on stage, not for 3/4 of an hour, but for a quarter of an hour, people would have had to pay to listen to him many hundreds of dollars. Is it because of the music, or is it because of what they perceive of the music? And if perception is nothing to do with the sight or the sound or the smell or the taste or the touch, and if perception is simply a function of the mind, then what is the origin of pleasure? So what is the meaning of living a materialistic world or a life, a materialistic lifestyle? What is the meaning of that? Do you understand? Do you realize why I have sought refuge from that? Why I have given up that meaningless pursuit of pleasure from a materialistic world? Your instincts will try to argue against what this professor is trying to tell you. I guarantee. Because you will want to protect yourself. This is a blow to your ego, where you're being proven to be wrong. I'm saying this because I want you to be aware of this, because this will happen subconsciously. You're not aware that this is happening right now, but it's happening. All your brain power, your intellect, your thinking patterns and processes will all go to try and prove that no, this doesn't make sense. It can't be so. You can't tell me that I was lied to, I was taken for a fool for 70, 80 years of my life. All that wine I drank only tasted good because it came from a bottle that had an expensive label on it. Doesn't that just sound so pathetic? You see, this is what I'm saying. Buddhism is nothing to do with giving up. It's all about realizing. Not a single point in this video was about give up this, give up that, or give up anything else. It's all about realization. Sharing with you the truth. And when you learn the truth, you realize there's nothing to give up. Because the moment you realize something, you realize also that you're not holding on to it anymore. The amount to which you have realized, the amount to which you have also realized that you're not holding on to it any longer because it was not worth it. I appeal to your intellect, folks. Go back and watch this again if you must. Try and understand what we're trying to get across to you here. All of this is to try and help you realize what you're doing. And your pursuit of happiness is not going to get you happiness. Surrounding yourself with physical objects in a materialistic world, surrounding yourself with sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch is not going to make you happy, because happiness is not in there. It's not going to give you pleasure, because pleasure is not to be found in them. Pleasure is a perception, is a function of the mind. See, think about it this way. When pleasure is a function of the mind, even if pleasure was not from relief from vexation, or rather, even if pleasure is relief from vexation, okay? But if pleasure is a function of the mind, then what are you doing in a materialistic world? Shouldn't you take yourself somewhere where you can continue to develop your mind? Continue to work on your mind. Continue to study the science of the mind so that you can experience ultimate pleasure, infinite pleasure. Guess what I'm up to? Guess what myself and my fellow monks are up to? This is the secret that no one let you in on. This is the truth that no one dares tell you. Most those people listening to that talk in the auditorium, they don't know an alternative, so they can be forgiven. But you can't tell me you don't know of an alternative. If pleasure, if joy, if happiness is wholly a mental affair, what are you doing? Holding on to that bunch of roses. What are you doing? Digging your teeth into that slice of pizza. What are you doing? Holding that bottle of perfume in your hand and sniffing it. What are you doing? What are you doing going places? Attractions. What are you doing? What are you doing? If the purpose of life is to experience as much pleasure as you possibly can, And along the way, give other people as much pleasure as you possibly can. And if pleasure is a mental affair altogether, what are you doing with sights and sounds and smells and taste and touch? Again, I ask you, realize. Don't give up anything. Just realize. Open your eyes, open your ears, listen to this, and see what it means to you.
He actually made $20 more than that, but he didn't count it. Because this woman comes up, you see her at the end of the video, she comes up, she had heard him at the Library of Congress a few weeks before at this extravagant black tie affair, so she's stunned that he's standing in a subway station. And so she's struck with pity. She reaches into her purse and hands him a 20. And the second example from music is from John Cage's modernist composition, 4 minutes, 33 seconds. As many of you know, this is a composition where the pianist sits at a bench, opens up the piano, and sits and does nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, that period of silence. And people have different views on this, but what I want to point out is you can buy this from iTunes. For $1.99, you could listen to that silence, which is different than other forms of silence. Now, I've been talking so far about pleasure, but what I want to suggest is everything I've said applies as well to pain. And how you think about what you're experiencing, your beliefs about the essence of it, affect how it hurts. One lovely experiment was done by Kurt Gray and Dan Wegner. What they did was they hooked up Harvard undergraduates to an electric shock machine, and they gave them a series of painful electric shocks. So there's a series of 5 painful shocks. Half of them are told that they're being given the shocks by somebody in another room. But the person in another room doesn't know what they're giving them shocks. There's no malevolent, they're just pressing a button. The first shock is recorded as very painful. The second shock feels less painful because you get a bit used to it. The third drops to fourth and the fifth. The pain gets less. In the other condition, they're told that the person in the next room is shocking them on purpose, knows they're shocking them. The first shock hurts like hell. The second shock hurts just as much, and the third and the fourth and the fifth. It hurts more if you believe somebody is doing it to you on purpose. The most extreme example of this is that in some cases, pain under the right circumstances can transform into pleasure. Humans have this extraordinarily interesting property that will often seek out low-level doses of pain in controlled circumstances and take pleasure from it, as in the eating of hot chili peppers and roller coaster rides. The point was nicely summarized by the poet John Milton, who wrote, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven." And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Okay. That's the end of that video. I hope you learned about whom? Professor Bloom? No, about yourself. I remember to this day, I think it was in the first or the second sermon, most certainly in the first 5 or 10 sermons that I did all the way right back in the UK, to Dasahandro and his 2 sisters sitting in front of me. He was in Dasahandro back then, and a small audience on a Skype call. We discussed how pleasure is derived from a roller coaster ride. That was repeated on several sermons. But how does one get pleasure from pain? With pain comes the opportunity. I know that sounds so funny. With pain rather, comes the opportunity to vex and then relieve from it. People have learned to seek pleasure from pain. So much so that it has now developed into various forms of gratification in some quarters. To take pleasure from pain. See, how can pleasure be derived from pain? The pain is just as painful. It is no different. But the pain perceived as pleasure is pleasurable. That is how it's pleasurable. To put it in the most polite way that I can, today there are people who hurt each other behind closed doors and consider that to be pleasurable. Behind closed doors, in dimly lit rooms, let me just put it that way, they'll hurt each other and they'll say that's pleasurable. Why? Because pleasure is not in the stimuli, it's not in the experience. Pleasure is a wholly mental affair. So it matters not whether you're experiencing pleasure or pain on the outside. If the mind chooses to perceive that as pleasure, the mind will perceive it as pleasure. A stranger could come and slap you, and that could make you very angry, and you might even retaliate. But a lover, a partner, could slap you, and in the right circumstances, I must add that, you'll enjoy it. An insect bite is ever so painful, but sometimes there are some bites that are considered to be so pleasurable. How is that so? Is that not proof that pleasure is not something that is in the physical experience? It is not in the outward, it is on the inside. It's a product of a mental function. It's a perception, it's a mental experience. Then does it not become important for us to study the science of the mental science of pleasure, and how it is a mental affair, and how the mind, what is the role of the mind in it? What are the conditions that give rise to pleasure? So you see, once you begin to at least consider this, folks, you lose interest in the outward physical world out there, just as has happened to us. We have lost interest in the outside world things. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. Not interested. Talk to the hand. Not interested anymore. Why? Because pleasure is not in there. Even if we wanted and sought pleasure, after all, pleasure is relief from vexation, and our task is to free ourselves from vexation, or rather, redeem ourselves from vexation. That's besides the point. Even if we were still addicted to pleasure, the best thing to do is give up the outside world, because that has nothing to do with pleasure. None whatsoever. Anything that is pleasure related is mental. Pleasure is, of course, a relief from vexation, but that can be understood or realized as a third stage. The first stage of ignorance is that pleasure can be found from materialistic things. The second stage of wisdom, be that worldly, is that pleasure has nothing to do with the worldly experience. It is solely a mental experience, so there's nothing to do. This is like the yogis. People who live in solitude, people who've given up, renunciated a worldly life. The mendicants, monks, not Buddhist monks, but monks, yogis, and other religious followers. They've given up a worldly life, worldly existence. They realize, pleasure is not in the physical world. It's wholly mental. So therefore, they take nothing but their mind with them, and they go and do everything they possibly can to extract every ounce of pleasure possible from their mind, using those mental processes. And then ultimately you have Buddhist philosophy, which goes one step even further and says pleasure Yes, agreed, it's not in the outside world. And secondly, it is in the mind, yes, but finally, let's not fool ourselves that pleasure is simply relief from vexation. So, therefore, the objective of life for ultimate pleasure, which is not the same as pleasure that the mendicants and the yogis experience, for ultimate pleasure, the answer is not in relief from vexation, but rather in the redemption from it. Bring an end to vexation, and you are in pleasure. You don't need to do anything for it. It is the pursuit of pleasure that puts one into pain. And the ignorance of this, what we've just discussed there, ignorance of this is ignorance of Buddhist philosophy. Knowledge of this, comprehension of this, is understanding of Buddhist philosophy. What do you have to give up? Where's the giving up part? Life is simply about the pursuit of pleasure and happiness. You must all accept that by now. Even if one chooses to commit suicide, that's because they're not content with the amount of pleasure that they're able to achieve in their current circumstances. They want a better pleasure. They want even more pleasure. They want a bigger, higher level of happiness. So, coming into life, you wanted pleasure. And some people choose to leave life because they still want more pleasure. Coming in, leaving, and the time in between is all in the pursuit of pleasure. So then think about it. What if at the age of 80 you realize that pleasure was not in any of the things that you went after in that total lifetime? How pathetic you'd feel about yourself? How much of a loser you'd feel about yourself? That is why I'm urging you to open your eyes and consider the facts. Today you've heard from a renowned psychologist. He's a world famous chap. He goes all over the place giving talks. You can Google him, YouTube him. He's all over the place. And he's one of my teachers. I learned psychology from him. I have his lectures, his series of lectures, and I follow them. Good teacher, good psychologist. And I have all the more respect for the work that is embarked on. Hopefully, as I have today found him to be my teacher, hopefully he might find the doctrine, the sermons that we preach, the Dhamma that we preach, a teacher to him one day. So think about this, folks. I wanted to share that with you because I wanted you to set aside your conventional ways of thinking and be broad minded, be open minded. It is a pity that people will disregard anything that does not come from the mouth of for someone who they believe to be a scientist. The world's best scientist will not be born in future. The world's best scientist passed away 2,500 years ago. He lived 2.5 millennia ago. He was the world's best scientist. Today, what science is doing is trying to get to what he taught. And this is evidence of that. Even after all this, some of you will still choose to ignore the blatantly obvious. And that's still okay. I'll keep on trying, finding other ways to convince you. Why? That is my job. That is our duty as a Sangha, to help as many people as we possibly can. Back in the old days, when I was not so wise, I used to think to myself, let's preach to people. If they don't understand it, if they don't choose to follow it, if they disregard it, if they have no show no respect, then so be it. It's not my loss, it's their loss. But I have now come to realize that I need to be better than that. Compassion cannot know any bounds. As I seek to achieve an infinite compassion, I realize that I can't be picky and choosy about the people and the tendencies in people that I'm willing to help overcome. The amount by which I do that, I'm less of a sangha. So I have realized that I need to be more open-minded. I need to be more helpful. My teachers stopped at nothing to help bring me out of my foolishness. No stone left unturned, no expense spared. No tear or drop of sweat left unshed. They did everything in their power to take me out of my steadfast and square-headed minded ways, hard-minded ways. So I must do the same. So I know, I appreciate that there'll still be some people, even after all that, they'll still say, no, pleasure is in the experience that we get from the outside world. I'll keep on trying on your behalf. But for those who this may have done something, even if you feel, actually, you know what? I need to go back to the drawing board. What the Swaminatha has been saying all along, science is beginning to accept and agree with this. That talk was back from 2011. We are in 2021. 10 years have passed since that talk was given. More research must have been done, more findings made, more discoveries made. I think the professor has gone on to write several books. I'm informed there's another one coming at the end of this year. So he's one of my teachers now as my psychology teacher. So I will learn from him. But what I learn from him, I'll always add what I know about the truth. I will learn from him what I can so I can help other people. I can help other people realize that Buddhism was always right. Science is catching up. One day, science will perfect itself, and then when that day comes, you can no longer call science science. Because science is intrinsically about identifying what's wrong with itself, the totality of its knowledge pool, identifying what's wrong with itself, and continuously rectifying it. Going back to the drawing board, doing the experiments and the tests, proving and disproving hypotheses. This is what science is all about. So one day when it perfects itself, then science has nothing to do with science. So you can no longer call it science. That day it's going to have to be called Buddhist philosophy. When that's going to happen? In a very long time. Maybe another 5,000 years, 10, 15, 20,000 years. Maybe in a million years. How lucky are you? Whether you're at the age of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, or 80, or even if you're 90, in this lifetime, you have realized what science is trying to find in a million years' time. No one's going to believe you, scientists least of them, but what they're going to realize one day, you have realized today. So be heedful. what you have learned, bear it, practice it, and free yourself from suffering. Freedom from suffering is ridding the mind of vexation, not relief from it. Mark my words, one day science will say pleasure is relief from vexation. One day they will say that. And then they will come across, how do we rid the mind of vexation? Because if there wasn't any vexation, then you wouldn't need to relieve your mind of it. Then some fine scientists will say, isn't it attachment that brings us vexation? And that may be after 5,000 years from now. Can that be? No, that will never happen. Only from the holy mouth of a supreme Buddha can you ever hear those words. No matter how much science advances, unless science considers the teaching of a Buddha, it will never identify the true cause of suffering. It will forever strive to free the human race from suffering, but it will never succeed. Long may it keep trying, because, of course, right, there are very few people, very few human beings, a tiny, minuscule amount, who are interested in true freedom from suffering. What about the rest of them? They need something to take refuge in as well, don't they? So for every man and his dog, there's science. For the rest of us, well, we have Buddhist philosophy, thanks to the Buddha. I just wanted you, for those of you who are skeptical, on the fence, hopefully today's sermon has been helpful. For those of you who had already wholly accepted, of course, Swaminathan, there was nothing new I got from that video because I completely get it. I just want to remind you how lucky you are. Thank you once again for the person who submitted the verses as a gift to the lady who posed her question from last week. Thank you to the professor, because unbeknown to him, today he has helped many people. He may not know that his talk will do the rounds one day in the midst of the Buddha's words, wrapped in the Buddha's words. He may never realize that. He may never come to know that. But if one day he rejoices in merits, if he knows what the concept of that, then this will have done him a great deal of good. So we thank him wholeheartedly.